What would you do if the person you trusted the most suddenly turned their back on you? In a quiet village, a shocking betrayal unfolds, leading to a moment that no one could have predicted. Kindness can come from the most unexpected places, but will it be enough to overcome the darkness? Watch the full story to find out. Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping stories like this. Lydia's world had once been filled with color and light. A talented artist, her paintings were known for their vibrant depictions of life and emotion, captivating the hearts of anyone who viewed them. She had a reputation that extended beyond their small village, and her works were even displayed in prestigious city galleries. But all of that seemed like a distant memory now. One rainy evening, a tragic car accident left her paralyzed from the waist down, confining her to a wheelchair. The once bright future she envisioned was replaced with a gray, monotonous reality. Her days were spent within the walls of her modest home, where the silence was broken only by the ticking of an old clock and the faint hum of the wind outside. Her husband, Victor, had been her rock at first, helping her adjust to her new life. In the early days after the accident, he seemed committed to her care, staying by her side through painful physical therapy sessions and emotional breakdowns. But as months turned into years, something in him began to change. His patience thinned, his smiles grew rare, and the warmth in his eyes dimmed. Lydia tried to ignore the subtle shift, telling herself that Victor was just tired or stressed. But deep down, she knew their relationship was no longer what it used to be. Victor began to withdraw from her, spending more time outside the house and less time engaging with her. When he was home, his words were curt, and his presence felt heavy with unspoken resentment. Lydia noticed the way he avoided her gaze, the way he hesitated before helping her with simple tasks. She felt like a burden, though Victor never said it aloud. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day, and Lydia found herself retreating into her own thoughts to escape the suffocating atmosphere. One evening, as Lydia sat in her studio, now unused and gathering dust, she stared at a blank canvas. Her hands, once so adept at creating beauty, now rested motionless in her lap. She longed to paint again, to feel the joy of expressing herself through art, but the weight of her circumstances sapped her creativity. Her wheelchair felt like a cage, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had become stagnant. As she stared at the canvas, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Victor's growing coldness wasn't lost on the villagers either. While Lydia rarely ventured out anymore, the occasional visitor would bring news of her husband's behavior. "He's not the man he used to be," they would whisper. "He spends too much time at the tavern. Always looks like he's carrying the weight of the world." Lydia hated hearing these things, but she couldn't deny the truth in their words. She often wondered if Victor blamed her for the accident, though he never said it outright. The breaking point came one evening when Victor returned home late, his face lined with exhaustion and something darker, an expression Lydia couldn't quite place. He barely acknowledged her as he passed through the living room, muttering a half-hearted greeting. Lydia watched him silently, her heart sinking. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, to reach out and bridge the growing chasm between them, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she waited until he disappeared into their bedroom, the door closing with a soft click. Alone in the dimly lit room, Lydia felt a pang of loneliness so sharp it took her breath away. She tried to convince herself that things would get better, that Victor's distance was just a phase, but a small, insistent voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise. Victor, meanwhile, sat on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of frustration and bitterness. He had once loved Lydia deeply, but now he felt trapped, bound by obligation and weighed down by resentment. He knew these feelings made him a terrible person, but he couldn't suppress them. Every day felt like a prison sentence, and he longed for freedom, though he couldn't bring himself to admit it aloud. As the weeks passed, Victor's thoughts grew darker. He began to entertain the idea that perhaps things would be better if Lydia weren't around. At first, the thought horrified him and he pushed it away. But it kept returning, lingering in the corners of his mind like a shadow. It whispered promises of relief, of a life unburdened. And slowly, Victor began to listen. One morning, as he walked past the village square, Victor overheard a group of men talking about a bull named Thunder. The bull, they said, was notorious for its aggression. It had injured a farmer last year and was considered dangerous enough that most villagers avoided its pen entirely. The men laughed nervously as they recounted stories of Thunder's rampages, describing the beast as a ticking time bomb. Victor paused, the gears in his mind beginning to turn. Thunder's reputation gave him an idea, one that made his stomach churn with guilt, but also filled him with a twisted sense of possibility. If something were to happen to Lydia, it could be seen as an accident. No one would suspect foul play, and he would be free. The thought took root, growing stronger with each passing day, until Victor could no longer ignore it. He began to make his plans in secret, careful not to arouse suspicion. He would take Lydia to the pen under the guise of a casual outing, leave her there, and let nature take its course. It was a cruel and heartless scheme, but Victor had convinced himself it was the only way out. He told himself that life would be better for both of them. Lydia wouldn't have to suffer anymore, and he could finally move on. As the day of his plan approached, Victor's demeanor shifted. He became unusually attentive, offering to help Lydia with tasks he had ignored for months. She noticed the change and felt a flicker of hope, thinking that perhaps their relationship was beginning to mend. But Victor's kindness was hollow, driven not by love but by guilt and the desire to ease his conscience before carrying out his terrible act. Lydia, unaware of what lay ahead, allowed herself to believe that things were finally looking up. She didn't see the shadows in Victor's eyes or the cold calculation behind his forced smiles. And so, when he suggested a trip to the outskirts of the village, she agreed without hesitation, eager to spend time with him and recapture a sense of normalcy. As they prepared to leave, Lydia glanced at her dusty studio one last time. Something in her heart stirred, a quiet resolve that she didn't fully understand. Perhaps it was a longing for the life she had lost or a faint glimmer of strength that refused to be extinguished. Whatever it was, it would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Victor's transformation had been gradual but relentless, like a slow-moving storm gathering strength over time. He no longer saw Lydia as the vibrant woman she once was, nor did he feel the same love that had bound them together for years. Instead, he saw a shadow of her former self, a constant reminder of the life he felt was stolen from him. This bitterness festered, poisoning every corner of his mind until he could no longer see her as anything but a burden. It was a cruel perspective, but Victor clung to it, using it to justify the growing darkness within him. As Victor walked through the village one crisp autumn morning, his thoughts drifted to the story he'd heard about Thunder, the notorious bull. He recalled the villagers' hushed tones as they described its size and strength, the way it seemed to embody raw, untamed aggression. Thunder had become something of a legend, a creature most chose to avoid at all costs. For Victor, however, the bull represented an opportunity. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and perfect for what he had in mind. The more he thought about it, the more the idea solidified in his mind. He would use thunder to free himself from the life he had come to despise. Victor spent the following days observing the bull's pen from a distance. It was located on the outskirts of the village, near a stretch of fields bordered by dense forest. The pen was sturdy but weathered, its wooden beams creaking under the strain of containing such a powerful animal. Thunder was often seen pacing within, his massive frame radiating tension with every step. The villagers who passed by gave the pen a wide berth, some even crossing to the other side of the road. Victor studied the bull carefully, noting its movements, its reactions to noise, and the way it seemed to grow restless when approached. He convinced himself that the animal was exactly what he needed. The plan took shape in Victor's mind with chilling clarity. He would take Lydia to see the bull under the pretense of a leisurely outing, something to lift her spirits. He would leave her there, alone and vulnerable, trusting that Thunder's aggression would do the rest. To the outside world, it would appear as a tragic accident, one that would free Victor from the responsibilities he had come to resent. The thought both horrified and exhilarated him. He hated himself for entertaining it, yet he couldn't let it go. The possibility of starting over, of escaping the suffocating weight of his life, was too enticing to ignore. In the days leading up to his plan, Victor made an effort to appear attentive and caring. He brought Lydia small gifts, flowers from the market, a favorite pastry from the bakery, and spent more time with her than he had in months. Lydia, though cautious, allowed herself to hope that this marked a turning point in their relationship. She had missed the version of Victor who once made her laugh, who held her hand when she was scared, and who supported her dreams. His sudden attentiveness felt like a glimpse of that man, and she clung to it, desperate to believe that their marriage could be salvaged. Victor's newfound kindness wasn't without its cracks, however. Lydia occasionally caught a strange look in his eyes, a fleeting shadow of something cold and distant. It unsettled her, but she dismissed it as her own paranoia. After all, Victor had been so caring lately, going out of his way to make her feel valued. She didn't want to question his motives and risk ruining the fragile peace that seemed to be forming between them. The morning of the outing arrived, bright and cool with the crispness of autumn in the air. Victor wheeled Lydia out to the small car they rarely used and helped her inside with an ease that surprised her. He seemed lighter somehow, more relaxed, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Lydia felt a flicker of hope as they drove through the village, the familiar sights of the market and square passing by in a blur. She asked him where they were going, but Victor only smiled and said it was a surprise. She decided not to press him, savoring the rare sense of closeness between them. The car eventually left the cobblestone streets of the village and turned onto a dirt road that led to the outskirts. Tall trees lined the path, their golden and red leaves shimmering in the sunlight. Lydia gazed out the window, her mind drifting to memories of similar drives they'd taken in the past. She felt a pang of longing for the days when they were truly happy, when their love seemed unshakable. Perhaps this trip was Victor's way of rekindling that connection, she thought. The idea brought a small smile to her lips. When they arrived at the pen, Victor parked the car and got out, moving around to open the door for Lydia. She looked out at the wooden enclosure, noting the size and sturdiness of the structure. Inside, Thunder stood like a monument, his massive body dwarfing the space around him. Lydia's smile faltered as she took in the bull's presence. There was something almost menacing about him, a sense of barely contained power that made her uneasy. Victor's voice broke through her thoughts. "Come on, I thought you'd like to see him up close. He's quite the sight, isn't he?" His tone was light, almost cheerful, but there was an edge to it that Lydia couldn't quite place. He wheeled her closer to the pen, positioning her near the gate. Thunder lifted his head at their approach, his dark eyes fixing on them with an intensity that sent a shiver down Lydia's spine. She wanted to ask Victor why they were here, but the words caught in her throat. Something about his demeanor felt off, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. "I'll be right back," Victor said suddenly, stepping away before Lydia could respond. She watched as he walked toward the car, her unease growing with every step he took. She called out to him, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he disappeared behind the vehicle, leaving her alone by the pen. Thunder let out a low, rumbling sound, and Lydia's pulse quickened. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself that Victor would be back soon, that everything was fine. But deep down, a cold knot of fear began to form in her chest. She looked at the bull, then back at the car, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. As Thunder took a step closer, Lydia felt her hands tighten around the edges of her wheelchair. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger, that something terrible was about to happen. And for the first time in a long while, she realized just how alone she truly was. Lydia sat motionless in her wheelchair, the cold autumn air brushing against her face. Her eyes darted between the bull and the car where Victor had disappeared moments earlier. The tension in the air was palpable, every sound amplified, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the wooden fence, and the low, guttural snorts coming from Thunder. The massive bull stood a short distance away, his dark eyes fixed on her with an unreadable intensity. Lydia felt her chest tighten as fear began to settle deep in her bones. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Lydia called out again for Victor, her voice trembling, but there was no response. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized how exposed she was. She tried to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he had gone to get something from the car, or maybe he had stepped away for just a moment. But the growing pit in her stomach told her otherwise. She couldn't shake the memory of the fleeting coldness she had seen in his eyes that morning, a look that now seemed full of hidden intent. Thunder took a step closer, his massive hooves thudding against the ground. Lydia froze, gripping the arms of her wheelchair tightly. The bull's sheer size was overwhelming, his muscles rippling beneath his dark coat as he moved. His breaths were loud and heavy, sending puffs of vapor into the cool air. Lydia tried to remind herself that animals often mirrored the energy around them. If she stayed calm, perhaps Thunder would remain calm too. But staying calm was easier said than done. Her mind raced as she tried to understand why Victor had brought her here and left her like this. The setting seemed so deliberate, so calculated. She thought back to his sudden attentiveness in recent days, the small gestures of kindness that had seemed too good to be true. Her stomach churned as a horrifying realization began to take shape in her mind. Victor had planned this. Thunder let out a low, resonant bellow that sent a shiver down Lydia's spine. He took another step toward her, his head lowering slightly, his sharp horns glinting in the sunlight. Lydia instinctively leaned back in her wheelchair, her hands trembling. The proximity of the bull made her acutely aware of her vulnerability. She had no way to move, no way to defend herself. She was entirely at the mercy of this enormous creature. As Thunder approached, something unexpected happened. Instead of charging or acting aggressively, the bull stopped a few feet from Lydia and lifted his head. His dark eyes, which she had feared moments ago, now seemed almost curious. Lydia's breathing hitched as she watched him tilt his head slightly, his ears flicking forward. For a moment, it felt as though Thunder was studying her, trying to understand the strange, unmoving figure in front of him. Lydia's grip on her wheelchair loosened slightly. Her fear was still present, but it was joined by a flicker of something else. Hope. She cautiously extended one hand toward Thunder, her fingers shaking. The bull snorted loudly, and she froze, her heart leaping into her throat. But instead of retreating or lashing out, Thunder leaned his massive head forward, his wide nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air around her hand. Lydia's tears welled up as she realized that this creature, feared by everyone in the village, was showing her an unexpected gentleness. She gently rested her hand on Thunder's broad nose, the warmth of his skin surprising against the cool air. He remained still, his breath deep and steady. Lydia felt a sob rise in her chest, not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't thinking about her disability, her isolation, or Victor's betrayal. She was simply present in this moment, connected to this unlikely guardian. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Lydia turned her head to see a figure coming toward her. It was Nikolai, the elderly farmer who often walked this path. His weathered face was etched with concern as he hurried closer, his eyes darting between Lydia and the bull. Thunder turned his head slightly, acknowledging Nikolai's presence but remaining calm. "Lydia?" Nikolai's voice was steady but tinged with urgency. "What are you doing here? Are you all right?" Lydia's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "Victor, he brought me here and left. I don't know why. He just walked away." Nikolai's brow furrowed, and he glanced at the car parked a short distance away. "He left you here? Alone? With Thunder?" His tone shifted, a mixture of disbelief and anger. He stepped closer to Lydia, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be all right. I'm here now." Lydia felt a wave of emotion crash over her, the tears she had been holding back spilling freely down her cheeks. "He didn't come back," she whispered. "I think he wanted something to happen to me." Nikolai's expression darkened as he absorbed her words. He looked at Thunder, who had stepped back slightly but remained near Lydia, his calm demeanor unshaken. The old farmer shook his head, his jaw tightening. "We need to get you out of here," he said firmly. "But first, I'm calling the police." As Nikolai pulled out his phone, Lydia watched him with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but Nikolai's presence gave her a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Thunder let out a soft huff, almost as if he were agreeing with Nikolai's plan. Lydia reached out to touch the bull one last time, her hand brushing against his warm coat. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The police arrived quickly, their presence disrupting the quiet tension that had settled over the scene. They listened carefully as Nikolai explained what had happened, their expressions growing grim as they pieced together the details. One officer approached Lydia gently, crouching down to meet her gaze. "We'll find your husband," he assured her, "and we'll make sure he answers for this." As Lydia was wheeled away from the pen, she cast one last look at Thunder. The bull stood tall and proud, his gaze following her as she left. In that moment, Lydia felt a profound sense of connection to the animal, a bond forged in an unlikely moment of kindness and trust. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. Thunder had saved her life in more ways than one. Victor didn't make it far before the police caught up with him. He was walking along the dirt path leading back into the village when the sound of a car engine approached from behind. 2 officers stepped out, their faces serious, their movements deliberate. Victor stopped in his tracks, his expression blank as they approached him. He didn't resist when they told him he was being detained for questioning, didn't flinch when they placed the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. There was no fight in him, no attempt to deny what he had done. It was as if he had been expecting this. Back at the pen, Lydia was being comforted by Nikolai while the police collected her statement. She sat in her wheelchair, her voice trembling as she recounted what had happened. Nikolai stood close by, his presence steady and reassuring. The officers listened intently, their notebooks filling with details of Victor's actions and the events leading up to the moment he abandoned her. Lydia's hands shook as she spoke, but she pushed through, determined to make her voice heard. When the officers returned with Victor in tow, Lydia's breath caught in her throat. He looked at her briefly, his face devoid of any emotion, before being escorted into the back of a police car. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Lydia searched his face for answers. She wanted to see regret, shame, or even anger, anything that might explain why he had done this to her. But Victor's expression remained impassive, as though he had already accepted his fate. The ride back to the village was a quiet one. Lydia sat in a separate police car, Nikolai by her side. He spoke to her softly, trying to ease her nerves, but Lydia's mind was elsewhere. She replayed the events of the day over and over, the realization of Victor's betrayal cutting deeper with each repetition. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the cold, calculated nature of it, the fact that he had looked her in the eye and lied to her pretending to care. The thought made her chest ache, and she turned her head to gaze out the window, watching the trees blur into a haze of gold and brown. At the station, Lydia gave a formal statement, recounting everything in detail. The officers were kind and patient, but the process was draining. By the time she was finished, exhaustion had set in, both physical and emotional. Nikolai stayed with her throughout, ensuring she wasn't alone. When the officers finally escorted Victor into a holding cell, Lydia felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and an overwhelming sadness that threatened to consume her. Victor's arraignment came quickly. Word of his actions had spread through the village, and the small courtroom was packed with curious onlookers. Many of them had known Victor and Lydia for years, and the news of his betrayal had sent shockwaves through the community. Whispers filled the room as Victor was led in, his hands cuffed in front of him. He didn't look at anyone, his gaze fixed on the floor. Lydia sat near the front, her wheelchair positioned beside Nikolai, who had refused to leave her side. The prosecutor laid out the case with precision, detailing Victor's plan and the evidence that supported it. Lydia's statement was read aloud, and the room grew tense as the full scope of Victor's actions came to light. When the time came for Victor to speak, he stood, his posture rigid. His voice was cold and devoid of emotion as he admitted to everything. "I wanted to be free," he said simply, his words echoing through the silent courtroom. "I thought this was the only way." Gasps rippled through the room, and Lydia felt a fresh wave of anger and heartbreak. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he might show some sign of remorse. But Victor's confession only reinforced what she had already come to understand. He had stopped seeing her as a person long ago. To him, she was nothing more than an obstacle, something to be removed. The judge didn't mince words in his sentencing. He condemned Victor's actions as cruel and calculated, a betrayal of trust so severe that it warranted the harshest punishment allowed by law. Victor was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his fate sealed by his own admission. As he was led away, Lydia felt a strange sense of finality. The chapter of her life that had been dominated by Victor's presence was now over. After the trial, villagers approached Lydia to offer their support and condolences. Many expressed their shock at Victor's actions, their voices filled with disbelief. Lydia thanked them politely, but the words felt hollow. She appreciated their kindness, but nothing they said could undo what had happened. Her life had been forever altered, not just by the accident that took her mobility, but by the betrayal that followed. She knew it would take time to heal, and she wasn't sure if she would ever truly trust again. Nikolai offered to take Lydia back to his home for the night, sensing that she needed space and time to process everything. She accepted gratefully, the prospect of returning to the home she had shared with Victor too overwhelming to consider. As they drove through the village, Lydia thought about Thunder, the bull who had shown her more compassion than the man she had once loved. She made a silent promise to visit him soon, to thank him properly for what he had done. That night, as she lay in the guest room of Nikolai's modest farmhouse, Lydia stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The events of the past few days had left her shaken, but somewhere deep within her, a spark of determination began to grow. Victor might have tried to break her, but he hadn't succeeded. She was still here, still breathing, still alive. And she intended to make the most of the second chance she had been given. The days following Victor's sentencing were a blur for Lydia. She had expected to feel relief, perhaps even vindication, but instead there was a hollowness inside her, a lingering ache that no amount of kind words or well-meaning gestures could fill. Victor's betrayal had cut deep, leaving scars that she knew would take time to heal. Yet, as painful as it was, Lydia also felt a quiet resolve beginning to take root within her. She was free now, not just from Victor's cruelty, but from the shadow of his presence that had loomed over her life for so long. After staying with Nikolai for a few days, Lydia returned to her home. The house felt different, emptier, but not in the suffocating way it had before. Now, the silence felt like a blank canvas, a space waiting to be filled with new beginnings. She moved through the room slowly, reacquainting herself with the space that had once felt like a prison. The dust-covered easel in her studio caught her eye, and for the first time in years she felt a flicker of inspiration. There was something she needed to express, something she needed to capture on that blank canvas. Lydia spent the next few weeks rediscovering her art. It started with small sketches, tentative lines on paper that gradually gave way to bold strokes of paint. Her first completed piece was a portrait of Thunder, the bull who had stood by her side when she had felt most alone. She painted him as she remembered him, strong, steady, and watchful, his dark eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. The painting was more than just an image. It was a tribute to the animal who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. Word of Lydia's work spread quickly through the village. Nikolai, ever the proud friend, brought visitors to see her paintings, which now filled her small studio. People were drawn to her art, not just for its beauty, but for the emotion it conveyed. Her pieces told a story of resilience, of finding light in the darkest of moments. Lydia found herself speaking to villagers who had once seen her only as the quiet woman in the wheelchair. They listened intently as she shared her journey, their admiration evident in their eyes. As her confidence grew, Lydia began to think about her future. She realized she didn't want to stay in the village forever. It held too many memories, both good and bad. With Nikolai's encouragement, she started looking into opportunities to showcase her work in the city. She knew it would be a challenge, but the thought of starting fresh filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Before leaving the village, Lydia made a point to visit Thunder. Nikolai accompanied her to the pen, where the massive bull now roamed freely in a spacious enclosure on his farm. When Lydia wheeled up to the fence, Thunder lifted his head, his ears flicking forward as he recognized her. She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude as she reached out to touch the wooden slats separating them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "You saved me that day. You gave me a chance to keep going." Thunder let out a low, rumbling sound, his dark eyes watching her intently. Nikolai stood nearby, a quiet witness to the moment. He had grown fond of Thunder, who had become something of a legend in the village. Children came to see him, their laughter ringing out as they marveled at his size and strength. To Nikolai, Thunder was more than just an animal. He was a reminder of the unexpected kindness that could emerge in even the bleakest of circumstances. Lydia's departure from the village was bittersweet. She said her goodbyes to the people who had supported her, to the familiar sights and sounds that had shaped her life for so long. Nikolai drove her to the city, his weathered hands steady on the wheel as they traveled the winding roads. When they arrived, Lydia felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. The city was a world of possibilities, a place where she could carve out a new life for herself. Over time, Lydia's art gained recognition in galleries and exhibitions. Her paintings, many of which depicted thunder and other animals, resonated with audiences far beyond the village. People were drawn to the raw emotion in her work, the way it captured both struggle and hope. Lydia found herself speaking at events, sharing her story with others who had faced their own hardships. Her words and art became a source of inspiration, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Though she thrived in the city, Lydia never forgot the village or the people who had stood by her during her darkest days. She returned occasionally to visit Nikolai and Thunder, finding comfort in the familiar embrace of the countryside. Each visit felt like a homecoming, a chance to reconnect with the place that had shaped her and the animal who had saved her. One day, as she stood by Thunder's pen, Lydia reflected on how far she had come. The pain and betrayal she had endured were still a part of her, but they no longer defined her. She had built a new life, one filled with purpose and meaning, and in doing so, she had proven to herself that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, it was possible to find light. As the sun set over the farm, casting a warm glow across the fields, Lydia smiled. She knew her journey wasn't over. There were still more stories to tell, more art to create, and more lives to touch. But for now, she felt at peace, grateful for the second chance she had been given and determined to make the most of it. Thunder let out a soft, contented snort, and Lydia reached out to touch his strong, steady frame. Together, they stood in the fading light, a testament to the resilience and kindness that had carried them both through the storm. What an incredible journey of resilience and unexpected kindness. Lydia's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, light can emerge from the most unexpected places. What do you think about her journey? Could you have found the strength to move forward as she did? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories.